Are we ready? Holy. You can hear me now for sure. All right. Well, thank you, Paul, and thank you, Scott, for getting this working. That's great. I'm pleased to have an opportunity to be here today to talk about a Victoria War story. But just a note on terminology before I get started. Military nurses, at the time I'm talking about it for the First World War, were called nursing sisters. So when I refer to them, they are military nurses. So on August 21st, 1915, a really unusual event occurred in Victoria. A group of women in uniform marched from the drill hall on Menzies down to a waiting ship in the harbor. Now, Victoria had been used to seeing troops marching by this time, 1915, August, because of course the wars had started the previous August. But to see women marching was really unusual, and in uniform. Well, these were officers of the Canadian Army Medical Corps, and they were heading off for somewhere in what they assumed would be Western Europe. This is what they thought at the time. Now, the members of this hospital were enlistees in the Canadian Army Medical Corps. This was an organization that traced its origins back to 1885 to an event that is variously called the Riel Rebellion, the Northwest Rebellion, or the Resistance. You choose your terminology. And so it first got its experience there with the Canadian Army. And then through the Boer War, it developed further expertise with military medicine. And so in 1904, it was formally created by the Canadian government. It was made a permanent establishment with 20 officers as doctors, 5 nursing sisters who were lieutenants, and 102 other ranks. For its non-permanent establishment, it had field ambulances and clearing hospitals, in addition to the medical officers of the militias that were scattered across the country. Although in effective existence for only about 10 years before the war started, apparently, this is from the readings that I've done and the evidence, it seems to be that this unit was as well prepared for the war as any other unit in the Canadian Army. Now, when war started in August 1914, the Canadian government put out a call for volunteers to assemble at Valcartier, Quebec, for service overseas. Now, the early members of the CAMC also arrived there and joined about 30,000 people who collected there, mostly men. And they formed the first contingent, very famous first contingent of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. Now, Valcartier was not a fun place to be. There were only 3 wells, and although there was a river running through it, the Jacques Cartier River became polluted very quickly. And it was only thanks to the presence of the CAMC that a typhoid epidemic was avoided. Now, before I go on, I just want to sort of place the general hospitals, because I'm going to be talking about Canadian General Hospital number 5. And I just want to place it in the context of the system that was developed during the war for the movement of soldiers through the medical system. As you can see here, so let me see if I can get my little pointer. Up here, so you start at the battlefront, you have first aid posts, then dressing stations, down through various dressing stations, down to the casualty clearing stations where the first major medical treatments would work, and that was the first place that they would encounter nursing sisters. They would be sent to a railhead, and by rail sent down to a stationary hospital, which was a fairly large hospital. And the stationary hospitals were not quite as big as the general hospitals, which were positioned close to an evacuation point. The stationary hospitals, strangely enough, were hospitals that could move. I have never yet determined why they were called stationary hospitals, but they moved them around all over the place.
It's the Army.
Yeah, exactly. So, just it's a little awkward with my microphone here. So the general hospitals, out of all the available resources in the first contingent, so remember we have the first contingent at Valcartier, volunteers from across the country being organized by the military into units. And initially, the government thought that they could need 2 general hospitals and then some stationary hospitals and some field ambulances and that kind of thing. Those 2 hospitals left with the first contingent when they left for England on October 3rd, 1914, in that huge convoy that there's paintings of and that going overseas. However, of course, it soon became apparent that many more medical facilities would be needed. And so we have a series of general hospitals that were organized. The first one after those 2 was McGill University, that was organized May 3rd, 1915. Then we have the University of Toronto organizing number 4 in May 25th, 1915. You see how these are coming on very quickly. Then we have, strangely, our hospital here in Victoria that was raised by some very dedicated doctors. Then we continue with the universities. Laval University became number 6 in 1915. Queen's University organized a stationary hospital that was turned into a general hospital. And so those were the first hospitals that were organized and sent overseas. By the end of the war, Canada would have 16 general hospitals, most of which were in England. So mostly dealing with serious injuries back in England that needed a long time for recovery. So number 5 was an anomaly. It was the only regionally organized hospital that came about. Now, how it came about was that there were 2 doctors in Vancouver, Monroe and Proctor, and they were very keen to get a hospital organized based in Vancouver. However, Major E.C. Hart, who you see here, he proposed to them that it be a hospital that was organized with recruits from all over BC. So it would be a BC hospital. And so they agreed, and in February 1915, Major Hart proposed to Ottawa that this hospital be organized, and what did Ottawa say? No. Now, they must have known they needed more hospitals, but they said no. So Major Hart just, stayed around, still encouraging this, and then finally in May 30th, the government turned around and said, yes, we need a hospital right away. So they went about recruiting people. Now, I want to talk a little bit, just briefly, about Major Hart, because he's a really interesting fella. He was originally from Nova Scotia. He came to Victoria after earning his medical degree. He was a big man, 6 feet tall. This was when the average height of the Canadian soldier was 5'7", so he would have stood out in a crowd just the way Currie did. And he owned the first car in Victoria. In 1917, he was awarded by the British the Order of St. Michael and St. George. After the war, he returned to Victoria, set up private practice, and became the coroner for the next 41 years until he was 90 years old when he died. So, yeah, long-term position. So, May 30th, 1915, we have the general hospital is ordered, and we have recruitment from across BC. We have doctors, we have nurses, we have other ranks coming in. And training begins on Macaulay Plains at Esquimalt. Now, those of you who know about Victoria's history in World War I, you know that we had a military camp at Willows Fairground. Now, this is not to be confused with Willows Beach. Willows Fairground does not now exist, but it was a huge area with grandstands and stables and all of that, closer up to where University of Victoria is now. So it was up in that area. Carnarvon Park, if any of you know that, that's where it was, but a much larger area than Carnarvon Park is. So they began their training there, and the men had to live in tents, and the nurses had to find their own billets. And this just shows you where Macaulay Plains was, which is where the hospital was, practice ground was set up. It still exists. Some of you may have strolled around Macaulay Point, which is just off the end of Macaulay Plains. and it's still part of the military base there. So the men were put up in tents, the nurses had to find their own billets, and everybody had to learn military drill, including the nurses, who you see here drilling. Apparently they gave many minutes of humor to the soldiers, who called them penguins, from the way they walked in their long skirts when they were drilling. Now, before I continue, I want to introduce you to three people who I'm going to be quoting during this presentation, who wrote about their experiences with Canadian General Hospital Number 5. Now, this handsome young man is Private Frank Dunn. He was a reporter for both the Victoria Daily Times and the Victoria Daily Colonist. He went overseas with Number 5 initially as a stretcher bearer, but then he became involved in administration, and he was the editor of their newspaper. This was their own newspaper. Many units had their own little newspapers that they produced. In this case, it was initially called The Blister, but that was not a popular name, so they changed it for the more sedate The Convoy call. The convoy, in this case, referring to the convoys of ambulances that would come into a hospital after a battle. So that was published in 1916 while they were overseas. But in early 1917, Frank Dunn decided that he needed a change. So he decided to join the British Army, and the uniform he's in there is for the Durham Light Infantry. So he took officer training, was posted to France, and he was killed 2 weeks later on September 23rd, 1917, at the age of 27. But as you'll see, he had a really lively writing style, which just brings the whole experience to life. Now, the other two that I'm going to quote from are two nursing sisters, Ethel Morrison and Dorothy Collis, both of whom did their nursing training here in Victoria. And they both served in a variety of theaters. And after the war, they both continued nursing. Nursing sister Morrison was mentioned in dispatches twice, and she was awarded the Royal Red Cross, which is the highest award for military nurses. Now, let's get back to Number 5's training, and I'm going to quote Frank Dunn, writing in 1916, which was a year after full mobilization, but he's writing about what their early days were like. So here are some of the ways he describes what it was like when they were training at Macaulay Plains. Dreaded inoculations which seemed never to end, dusty route marches to the gorge, squad and stretcher drill interesting until we mastered it, laborious rehearsals of ceremonial parade. They were preparing for inspection by General Lassard at that point. Now, Dunn admits, he says, our lot was an easy one, an ideal campsite, abundant water, a bathing beach within a stone's throw, passes plentiful, and the guard tent doing a poor trade in lodgers. Weekend leave to Vancouver, and the inner man catered to in proper style. Apparently the chicken dinners were memorable. So, we have here, in the next slide, the entire unit. This is all 207 of them on Macaulay Plains. The nursing sisters are out in front. The other officers are in the center behind them, and the rest are all the other members of the hospital. And there's more, of course, to a hospital than officers, and that there's orderlies and stretcher bearers and cooks and administrators. So all of this was mobilized for Canadian General Hospital Number 5. And while that was going on, the community was also doing fundraising for the unit. They wanted to supply more than was standard government issue, and they raised enough money to provide 3 ambulances, plus there was leftover money that was deposited for the use of the commanding officer. The unit had a grand send-off when they were marching down to get on the ship to go away. And here's it was a big goodbye concert that was put on by both the hospital staff and the members of the community. And Frank Dunn described it as a sockdolager. A sockdolager, I'd never heard that term, but apparently it means an exceptional thing or person. So it must have been a term that was in use at the time. So finally, the day of departure arrives, August 21st, 1915, and I'll let Frank Dunn describe the scene. The fall-in sounds and we are off. We are met at the foot of Johnson Street by the 5th Regiment Band, and ours is some triumphal process. Cinemaed, shouted, sobbed, and sung, we turned into Government Street, met the sisters at the drill hall, and were given Godspeed by the largest crowd that ever overweighed the CPR wharf. We marched on board the Princess Mary. So the Princess Mary took them to Vancouver, and then they got on a train and went across the country, and they eventually arrived in Montreal on August 27th. The train took them right onto the docks. They marched through the freight sheds and right on to RMS Scandinavian. They were 8 days aboard ship until they arrived at Plymouth. They arrived at midnight on September 4th and then went by train to Shorncliffe, arriving hours later, very early in the morning, after not having been fed since well before they actually landed in Plymouth. So Dunn describes what it was like. It was a cranky, hungry mob that tumbled out at Shorncliffe in the early, inky, raw, windy morning, sullen and full of grievances, kits all mixed up, and nobody happy. However, they got organized, and it's interesting that to get themselves all, like to recruit that hospital, get it all put together here and everything took 3 months, went over to Britain and took another 4 months before they were able to go on to their actual posting. So, in England, while they were there for those 4 months, initially they were split up and sent to all over the place, mostly in England. A few of them were sent over to France to support, to fill in for various British medical facilities. But Colonel Hart remained with the enlisted men at Shorncliffe, which, for those of you who are familiar with Canadians in the First World War, it was a pretty miserable place at that time. Apparently it was visited daily by wasps and drizzling rain. But in early October, they took over the Shorncliffe Military Hospital, and Dunn reported, "Our experience began in hospital work, an experience which proved a lasting benefit." And when I read that, I suddenly realized, well, of course, they had organized as a group, marched, learned their military drills, but they never worked all together as a hospital in the way a hospital functions. So this was something new for them, to get all this practice before they could go abroad. So, about 6 weeks later, the men, the officers, NCOs, and other ranks assembled at Southampton and were told they were going east. Where were they going? Were they going to the Persian Gulf? Were they going to Egypt? Were they going to Greece? They departed on a hospital ship November 16th, and they arrived in Salonika, Greece on the 25th. Anxious to go ashore, but that was not to be. All the docks were full with unloading troops. So they kept getting orders to disembark, which were canceled over several days. Finally, they took on a load of wounded and frostbitten patients. Salonika was close to Gallipoli. And they proceeded to Alexandria, so to Egypt. That's where they went. They docked there, and they were starting to unload equipment when they were told they were going back to Salonika. Okay, we're going off to Salonika. They got halfway there, and were told to go back to Alexandria. So they spent a week in Alexandria before they finally got to go to Salonika and arrived there on December 19th, 1915. Now, this map here shows where Salonika is. You can see it up here, and this was the front line, as it says here, November 1916 to September 1918, didn't move very much. And this was the actual, Lemnos was the first place that Canadian hospitals arrived. Of course, the Gallipoli was up in here. So what had happened is the Serbian army had been defeated by the Central Powers with help from their new ally, Bulgaria. And by the end of 1915, the map of Europe showed Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, along with Bulgaria, occupying much of the continent from France to Turkey. Greece was the exception, and Salonika was a strategically placed port. Now, the Brits wanted to move all their personnel back to the Western Front because it was needed there. But the French were set on staying there, as were the Italians, Russians, and Serbs, and so the Brits stayed to support their allies. But there were no Canadian soldiers fighting there. There were Newfoundlanders there, but of course they weren't part of Canada at that time. And so why did we stay? Why did we send medical personnel to that location? And it's because the Brits asked us to. And here's a quote from the Director General of the British Army Medical Service, Lieutenant General Sir Alfred Keogh, who wrote to his Canadian counterpart, Major General Guy Carleton Jones, in 1916 with his thanks. I had not any hospitals at the moment. I called upon you for assistance. Note, they had no hospitals. They've got the Gallipoli campaign going and that, and they had no hospitals. I called upon you for assistance. You gave me hospitals. They saved the situation. They were good hospitals containing good officers. I shall always be indebted to you for the help you gave me at the time when I was very hard pressed. The only alternative was to send home wounded in transports, which might have been sent to the bottom of the sea if you had refused the help I asked. You were quite entitled to refuse to send Canadian hospitals where there were no Canadian troops, and I am very glad you did not. And so, there we were. Now, we were not, number 5, Canadian General Hospital number 5, our hospital, was not the first Canadian medical unit in the region. Stationary hospitals number 1 and 3 had arrived on the island of Lemnos in mid-August 1915, and that's a whole other story. That was considered the worst conditions of the war on that little island where they were stuck and having to help the evacuees from Gallipoli. But then they moved to Salonika on the mainland. Now, the first Canadian General Hospital to arrive was number 4, the U of T Hospital, that arrived in November 1915, and then our hospital arrived a month later. But this was only the men. So where were the nursing sisters? I'll tell you in a moment. So after 5 weeks by travel by ship and all that back and forth to Alexandria, they were really looking forward to getting onto dry land and setting up their hospital, but wasn't very dry, the land that they arrived in. They arrived in drizzling, chill rain, and Dunn describes it. We pitched a temporary camp just off the main road on the outskirts to the southwest of the city, and there we wallowed in mud and slush for several weeks until the authorities settled the question of our permanent location. And the permanent location was much better. It was an area called, perhaps somebody here can help me with the Greek pronunciation, Kalamaria, I have no idea, but Kalamaria is what I'm going with. And as you can see from this picture, it was greatly expanded during the war. So the Canadian hospitals were up here in Area E, and the Area C was the, Area B was the Aeronautical Park, Area C was the Greek Cavalry Barracks, Area D was the Château des Aviateurs, where the French flyers lived, who apparently were very taken with our nursing sisters. And A was the gardens of the Villa Alatini. So where were the nursing sisters? They had left England a couple of weeks after the men, on December 4th, 1915, again just told they were going somewhere east. 2 weeks later, after a brief stopover in Malta, they arrived in Egypt, expecting to be very quickly sent. By this time they knew they were going to Salonika. However, the brief stopover turned into a 6-week stay in Cairo. And how did they use their time? Well, they had a great time, because they were not assigned to any medical unit. They were just left there. So they took full advantage. I mean, these are women who had very responsible women. The nursing sisters all had to be over 21, professionally trained nurses and all of that. But they probably hadn't lived really wide lives. And here they were in Egypt for 6 weeks. They went to pyramids, they went to mosques, they went on a cruise on the Nile. They took full advantage. However, they really wanted to get to work. And nursing sister Ethel Morrison recalled that they wondered why they were stuck in Cairo. She wrote, "Submarines? Perhaps the hospital ship used for our transport was needed at Alexandria or to help evacuate Gallipoli. This was not what we expected, but it proved to be the experience of a lifetime." In any case, that all ended on January 25th, and they got to Salonika, and they had a rough welcome because in the early morning of January 30th, 1916, so that was a month after the men, as their ships came in, they were bombed. And a bomb hit the ship, went into one of the bathrooms and broke some glass, but nobody was injured, fortunately. And so the conditions that they came to experience in Salonika was the pictures that you see here give you an impression of it. So the nurses were enjoying their time off. The other officers and enlisted men were busy preparing the camp, and it officially opened on January 1st, 1916. Sister Morrison wrote, "We were soon in our tent hospital. Living under canvas was a new experience. Our duties were constant, our wards difficult. The earth was our floor, the tents were our walls and ceiling. Along the sides were rows of beds with tables between them. Some of our patients were wounded. Many more suffered from dysentery and malaria." So eventually, in October, so from January to October, it took that long to get them out of tents and into huts. And there was very little surgical activity at first. They mostly catered to illness and injury among the local troops, but eventually they had wounded from casualties from Gallipoli. Now, the main enemies, as far as the medical folks were concerned with in Salonika, was the Macedonian climate and the mosquitoes. So, the mosquitoes carry a parasite, and when they sting a person, that parasite gets into the bloodstream, and that's what causes malaria. The symptoms of malaria: fever, chills, nausea, vomiting, muscle pain and fatigue, chest and abdominal pain, and coughing. And the thing with malaria, of course, is that it can come back. You can get it once, but then it can keep recurring. During the 3 years of the Macedonian campaign, 10 times as many British soldiers entered hospital with malaria as with wounds from enemy action. 10 times. So here's a description of the effect by one of the doctors in the British Army Medical Corps. "The Anopheles mosquito would turn ruddy-faced English lads into shivering malarial victims." Now, the mortality rate wasn't high. It was 1 in 207. The problem was it was a debilitating disease. And what would happen is that the soldiers would be so weak that they would only be fit for light duties. So you'd end up with huge numbers of soldiers that weren't capable of fighting. Now, there were efforts made, of course, to combat malaria. You can see here some soldiers taking their quinine treatment, but they also filled in swamps and pools. It was very swampy around Salonika, and brush was cut down. And a big factor was to help and reduce the effect of the mosquitoes was the use of mosquito netting. In fact, one of the generals said that the mosquito net was as important as the rifle in Salonika. The trouble was they didn't have a good steady supply of mosquito nets. And in 2 years, 1916 and 1970, the supply of mosquito nets, which was coming in from India, did not arrive in time for the start of the season when the mosquitoes were at their worst in the summer. The poet Rudyard Kipling summed up conditions on the Macedonian front in his poem Salonican Grave. He wrote, "It is fever and not the fight, time, not the battle that slays." Now, how about that climate? So we have freezing winds and torrential rains in winter, and incredibly hot, humid summers, which of course were particularly conducive to mosquito breeding. Number 5 arrived in December and got to experience the full force of the Macedonian winter. February 1916 is remembered for torrential rains and strong winds that lasted for weeks. On February 11th, nursing sister Collis went for a walk and wrote in her diary, "The mud was terrible. Our feet got so heavy we could hardly move them." In the hills where the soldiers were entrenched, there was snow and frostbite was an issue. In the hospital, they had to amputate toes and that because of the soldiers being brought in with frostbite. By June, the temperatures were over 38 degrees Celsius, 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The blister editorial about the heat called it the burning question of the day. And then there was the wind. Quote, "This wind blows across the burning deserts of Africa and is as hot as a blast from a baker's oven," unquote. However, this was a war zone, so these were not the only things that concerned the medical staff. In June 1916, battle casualties arrived from an Allied offensive, and nursing sister Collis wrote in her diary on June 26th, "We had 200 patients come in last night. It was after 11 before they all got to wards. Poor things. They were all so dreadfully tired and hot. It must be terrible coming down from the hills in this heat." On July 10th, she wrote, "They say men are dying in the Struma Valley." That's the British portion of the front. "They can't get them down here. It does seem terrible. Very busy all day, several very sick." The difficulty was with moving the wounded because of the rocky mountainsides. They couldn't use wheeled transport at all. The field ambulance relied on travois, on mule litters, which is 2 mules with a litter in between, or these cacolets that you see here, which is a mule with a support on both sides, sometimes for seated patients, sometimes for reclining patients. The fighting in the mountains continued through October and November against both Bulgarians and Germans, and these kept the hospitals overcrowded. There was an unsuccessful Army of the Orient offensive in April and May 1917, the insufficient troops, a late blizzard, there were well-fortified enemy positions in the hills, and the Bulgarians used gas shells for the first time. There were also German bombing raids on Salonika itself. The Allies attempted nighttime attacks, except that the enemy had very strong searchlights, and so those were unsuccessful as well. So there were other bombing attacks from enemy airplanes. The French sent up fighters against them, and so there was both civilian and troops killed. And in the early summer of 1916, the area was visited frequently by both Zeppelins and airplanes, and early morning air attacks became commonplace. Zeppelin raids occurred at night, and nursing sister Collis has a description of one that took place on the night of May 5th when a Zeppelin was shot down. "We had great excitement about 2 a.m. A Zepp was hovering about over our heads. The searchlights kept on it right across the sky. It looked like a huge lighted cigar. Shells were bursting all around it. About half an hour later, there was a very loud report. Then another, and the whole sky lit up. Navy ships in the harbor say they brought it down. You could hear the cheering on the ships and in the town." But there was such a range of stresses on these poor folks that were out there in the east. So we know about the lice on the Western Front. That was a real major problem there, and it was here too. But besides that, there were fleas, terrible, terrible infestations of fleas. The blister noted that it is the height of a flea's ambition to bite a lump that has already been raised by another flea. As one doctor noted, the men are literally crawling with vermin when they come in. The nurses have a continual fight to keep them clear. Now, the water supply was an issue. It was quite limited because it had to be brought in from a distance away, boiled and chlorinated to such a degree that the soup tasted of chlorine. Now, another factor that added to stresses was the distance from England. Now, the Western Front was terrible, no question. But you could get to England in no time at all and be in a completely different place and feeling entirely from the war zone. There was no getting there from here very easily. Not just the distance, but there was the whole problem of submarine warfare. The U-boats were in the Mediterranean, and it was a risk to send hospital ships, or any ships, through the Mediterranean. At one point in 1917, when the Germans declared unrestricted submarine warfare, hospital ships were canceled. All the sick and the wounded had to be retained at Salonika. There was no invaliding back to England. And then there were the various afflictions that the staff themselves were subject to. There was mental pressures, the stress, but there was also illness. There's the illness that the soldiers had, but of course, a lot of those illnesses were passed on to the staff. So this slide gives you a list of some of these factors that affected the staff. Debility was widespread. This is one that comes up again and again in their medical reports, in their service records. It included weight loss, insomnia, nervousness, and exhaustion. Neurasthenia, today we'd probably call it chronic fatigue. Nephritis, of course, was kidney disease. Tonsillitis. Tonsillitis is an interesting thing. I came across this when I have done research and talks about the Western Front. It was very common in soldiers. I also think I had tonsillitis when I was a kid. I bet a lot of you here had tonsillitis. But it was really serious with the soldiers, and it was contagious, and it could develop into a serious complication called quinsy, which is the other thing that's affected here. And all ranks of personnel were affected. So we have Assistant Matron Christina Campbell from Victoria here. She was on duty for 5 months in Salonika, which included 2 consecutive months of night duty. Her medical report stated previously she was in good health, but she was laid low by insomnia, debility, and pain in her back and arms. In June 1916, she was invalided back to England, where she was able to recover and serve in the hospitals there. In June 1918, she was transferred to transport duty. This was considered a lighter duty. This was the transport of Canadian soldiers, injured Canadian soldiers, back to Canada. And she was put on that duty. Unfortunately, she was on the Landovery Castle, which was torpedoed by a German U-boat, and all 14 nursing sisters on that ship died, including Christina Campbell. Now, Dr. Herman Robertson from Victoria made it almost all the way through his time in Salonika without any major afflictions until he was diagnosed in malaria after he got back to England. Initially, it was mistaken for influenza. And then Private Mills, the unit's bugler, you can see him there with his bugle. He was first diagnosed with malaria in 1916 and suffered numerous relapses. Between February and April 1917, he was readmitted 4 times for malarial relapses. A 1918 medical board stated that he had chronic malaria. Now, I have to say something about Private Mills because he had another relapsing problem that wasn't related to illness. I've never seen a service record that had so many mentions of field punishment number 1 and field punishment number 2 that was the grand finale of 15 days in detention in 1919. I think of him as the bad boy bugler. So, and I bet he contributed to the leisure time that they were able to enjoy because, yes, we talk about how terrible it was, how awful it was. People always find time to enjoy themselves in some way. And it was Salonika was just like that. There were excursions into town for shopping, and imagine that you're somebody from small town BC and you get to go into a Greek village and do shopping, and that it must seem so exotic. There were sports, just like on the Western Front. There were sports: baseball, cricket, lacrosse, soccer. There were concerts. The Royal Serbian Band played for them. And of course, costume parties. And this is something you come across all through the Canadian Expeditionary Force. Everybody loved a costume party. I particularly like the Charlie Chaplin on the right, far right, and the baby in the middle. I mean, that's just amazing. Now, some of the nursing sisters went on leave in January 1917, and they assumed they would be coming back to Salonika, but that is not what happened. They were dispersed to England and France. Now, the staff had heard rumors that they would be leaving soon from Salonika. Again, there were no Canadian soldiers fighting there. There was a big controversy back home in Canada, lots of questions being asked all the time. Why were Canadian military personnel wasting their time in Salonika when they could be helping Canadian soldiers on the Western Front and in England? So this continued throughout 1916. The rumors of leaving reached a fever pitch in early 1917, and final orders were received in May 1917. So May they received their final orders, but between receiving their final orders in May and when they handed over to the British, they had to deal not just with the ongoing medical cases, but also the results of that Allied campaign that I mentioned to you, the failed campaign that created so much pressure and resulted in heavy losses. Finally, in mid-August, so from May until August, they eventually handed over their hospital to the British. All the nursing sisters left Salonika by ship for Toronto, Italy on August 17th. They took 10 days to get from Salonika to Italy. And the reason for that was they would only sail at night. During the day, they hid in coves and bays all the way along to avoid the German U-boats. Once they arrived in Italy, they went by train to France and then over to England. The rest of the unit left September 4th, so just a few days after the nursing sisters, and they also made their way to England. Now, when they arrived in England, some of them were sent to France, but they still remained mainly as a unit for service in England, operating a very different kind of facility from the one that they had been operating in Salonika. But just before we leave Salonika, I just want to mention that between January 1st, 1916, when Canadian General Hospital No. 5 opened in Salonika, until they handed over to the British on August 16th, 1917, so that's about a year and a half later, they treated a total of 26,629 patients. So where did they end up? Got everybody leaving there. They ended up in Liverpool. The Canadian military had been setting up a new kind of hospital. This was necessary because they needed a collecting and clearing hospital for shipping Canadian soldiers back to Canada. And the ships were going out of Liverpool. So one of these was the Canadian Military Hospital Kirkdale, which was set up in an old workhouse, a very substantial building, as you can see here. So the men of No. 5 arrived at Southampton on September 26th, and on October 13th, they took over this hospital, and they remained there for the rest of the war, and the nursing sisters arrived later. This could hardly have been more different from their position in Salonika. First of all, they're in a major British metropolitan center. They have all the amenities they could possibly need. They had actual buildings, not tents and huts. They were looking after 1,300 beds instead of the 2,000 that they were looking after before they left Salonika. There was only a small operating room because by the time patients got to this hospital, they had had all their major treatments and they were stabilized, hopefully, for their trip home. Unfortunately, not everybody made it onto the ships, and about 100 of their patients are buried in the Kirkdale Cemetery. But one of the main purposes of this hospital seems to have been keeping up patient morale until they could put them on a ship. And this is some of the places that they took their patients. And so this slide shows places around Liverpool, and here's an excerpt from the war diary. Doesn't sound much like a war diary that you might have read, For November 9th, 1918, outings for patients. Shakespeare Theatre, 100 patients. Whisk drive and entertainment at Canadian Pacific Ocean Services, 76 patients. River trips and entertainment, 20 patients. Dance at Heatherfield Road Conservative Club, 25 patients. Quite a change from attending people with malaria and dysentery. The last outing that was recorded was August 7th, 1919, where they took 30 patients to Theatre Royal in Birkenhead, and the very next day, the war diary notes, "This hospital is now closed for the reception of patients. All inmates of this hospital being evacuated to Canada." So, I'm going to close with a couple of quotes. First, from a British soldier who was treated at number 5 hospital in Salonika. "This hospital is the best thing that ever happened. The doctors, I think, could cure a wooden leg." And finally, from our number 5 journalist, Private Dunn, writing in the last issue of the Convoy Call. Of course, he never saw what happened to the rest of the hospital later. But he wrote when they were leaving Salonika, "When the war is over and we are gathered around the home fires again, what a host of tales we will have to tell of the many strange things we have seen and heard and done while engaged in the great adventure. We have run the gamut of the most instructive and revealing experience of life at its worst and best, active service." So, quite a history. These people saw parts of the world they probably never dreamed they would get to. They were exposed to extremes of climate, they experienced severe personal deprivations, and they were often ill themselves. And then they ended up in England. I mean, it was like sort of a big reward for all they had experienced before, but it was certainly a record to be proud of. Thank you.